asking yourself, did you violate any secondary boundaries or any primary boundaries? Mm-hmm. And if you violated any primary boundaries, you're asked to write down what happened or what did you experience in the last 24 hours or 48 hours before that may have led up to it. Mm-hmm. So every day you're looking at, did I violate any of these boundaries? So in addition to discovering these boundaries, you start looking at and developing them. And we always say, if you violated a primary boundary and you say, well, I didn't violate any secondaries, we suggest that you look a little deeper. Mm-hmm. Because almost never did you just act out and nothing led up to it. Mm-hmm. One thing I say in the program is the urge to act out never just happens. Mm-hmm. There's always something that leads up to it.
Tell Them For Me, a podcast brought to you by Road to Purity, where recovering sex addict Dan opens up to his son David about his journey towards healing and redemption. Whether you're battling addiction or know someone who is, this podcast offers a beacon of hope and a reminder that you're not alone in this fight. Tune in and let's navigate this journey together.
Hello and welcome everyone to our Road to Purity podcast called Tell Them For Me. Some exciting updates this time. You're hearing us from a new office, a new studio. Thank you so much to all of our supporters who helped us get into this building. We're still in the midst of our capital campaign to finish out the building and the recording studio. Stay tuned. We've got video coming. We've got an upgraded studio coming, hopefully to be able to put out a lot better content for everybody. But very exciting to be here in this space. Super snowy Wednesday today in Colorado, where we're recording this from. Got almost 2 feet of snow outside. So for anybody else in Colorado who's hearing this later, hopefully you're driving safe. But what are we talking about today?
Today we're going to talk about boundaries, primary, secondary boundaries, and basically how they fit into recovery.
Cool.
So boundaries is something that in my own recovery I've discovered in other recovery programs that I have done and recovered through is something that is not real emphasized or not talked about a lot. And I discovered it's something that's extremely helpful in recovery in keeping people away from the near occasion of sin and so forth. One of the things that used to bother me so much is I would be in, a different recovery group. There's all kinds of different ones, and they would go around the room, and guys would share that guy would say, "Oh, I violated my boundary twice this week," mm-hmm. And they wouldn't even necessarily define what it was. And sometimes they would say, "Oh, I looked at porn and masturbated, once this week or once in the last 2 weeks," and it's whatever it was. And so sometimes they would define it, sometimes they wouldn't. And whoever's running the group would say, "Okay, thank you for sharing," and they go to the next person. Well, that doesn't really help a lot. Mm-hmm. It's like a confession and acknowledging that you violated something. But when you're in a recovery and you're trying to get past a behavior, there's always something underneath and why that behavior happens. So a big part of it is recognizing and understanding why you violated that boundary, what led up to it. Mm-hmm. And what we're talking about mostly when they say, "Oh, I masturbated or I violated a boundary," is we're talking about primary boundaries. And at that point, it's almost too far.
You're talking about the actual sin.
The actual sin, yes. Yeah. When you actually look at pornography and say, "I violated my boundary," which may be looking at pornography or committing adultery or even just masturbation or whatever, and it's like, okay, what happened before that? Mm-hmm. How did you get there? And there's often things that happen way before that we can start to change our behaviors that can prevent us from getting close to that. What happens a lot of times is what we have defined as is a secondary boundary, which is more different for everybody, are things that can come up that might lead you to that situation. Or it's a behavior. One example might be taking your phone into the bathroom. where your intent may not be to look at pornography, but you take your phone to the bathroom. Oh, I'm going to check my email. But while you're sitting there, you're just like, well, I'll just look at something. I'm alone and nobody's going to see, and you start looking at things you shouldn't. Or guys will say, everybody's gone to bed, I'm going to go to my computer and look at my email, and I'm going to check on Facebook. I'm just going to look at Facebook. And then pretty soon they're checking out their ex-girlfriend on Facebook, and they're looking at other things on Facebook. They're maybe or just Googling or looking at Instagram on actresses that they find attractive, and looking at what they wore at the last Grammys, where they're all revealing and stuff. And pretty soon they're taking one step closer and closer, and pretty soon, maybe half the time they go look at their email, they end up in looking at porn.
So it's about recognizing areas that aren't even necessarily problems, but recognizing your own habits, and where you end up in that situation, as innocent as it may be, you put yourself in a situation where, okay, well, now these things are kind of calling to me. You're on your computer checking your email late at night by yourself, and it's like, well, you're just checking your email.
Yeah.
Like, that's fine. And that may not be, but you're saying that's different for everybody.
Yeah.
The initial is going to have that as a secondary
Exactly.
boundary.
Primaries are pretty steadfast for most people. It's to cross the line, it's the sin.
Right.
But the secondary ones vary by person, and those are the ones that we have to develop on our own. And in our Restoring God's Foundation program, we go into depth on that, how to develop those, and we talk about them more in depth and give samples and examples. And there's one story that I recall. I remember it from years ago. I don't remember where it came from. Somebody may know, and send us a message if you know where the story came from. But I just remember the story, and it was a story about this princess looking for a new bodyguard. And she interviewed 3 different bodyguards, and the first one kind of said, "Oh, princess, I am very strong. I could take you to the edge of this cliff and keep you safe." And she said, okay, great. And the next bodyguard, and he goes, "Oh, princess, I could take you right to the very edge of this cliff, and I would keep you very safe right at the edge of this cliff because I am stronger than the other bodyguard." And the third bodyguard would say, "Princess, you are far too valuable. I would let you nowhere near that cliff." And she said, "You're hired. You're my new bodyguard." And that's kind of the idea of what we want to do. We want to stay away from this near occasion of sin, because as we get closer, it gets harder and harder to stay away. And in the program we have, there's an example of like 100 yards from the cliff after we give this story. And as you get closer to the cliff, it's on a hill. It begins becoming slippery, and the cliff gets steeper. Or not the cliff, the hill gets steeper as you get closer to the cliff, making it harder to turn back and go up. And I always use the example of it's next to impossible to make a U-turn on a train to come back.
Yeah.
And they say when you're starting looking at porn, it's over. Like the train has left the station. You're just going to finish probably. It's not impossible, but very often it's very difficult to stop at that point. So we want to get nowhere near that point, like the princess. So things like we don't take our phone in the bathroom. We may even put the phone to bed at night, for example. We'll put it on a charger in the kitchen when we go to bed, not even have it with us. Don't watch R-rated movies with sexual content. Often guys will say, "Well, it's got a couple of scenes here, so what? I can handle that." Well, you might handle that at the moment, but it begins triggering thoughts, and you begin thinking about that scene later. Going into a strip club. For me, I had to, as you heard in my previous podcast, if you listen to them, I had an issue with massage parlors. I would avoid, or still do, avoid streets that have massage parlors on them, or even strip clubs on them. I don't even want to go by them and go, "Oh, there's one. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, years ago, I used, I don't need the thoughts even being entertained."
That's a pretty heavy secondary boundary. You
Right.
can't go down certain streets.
Right. But I mean, still, you can drive down, but if there's certain streets that have them, or especially one that maybe you have visited in the past, if that's one thing that you've struggled with, that you just don't go down that street.
Right.
You just avoid that street, and that's just because the driving by it will trigger it. Strip clubs, there are certain streets that there's a lot of them at. There are, I mean, a lot of other certain things that are just sexually explicit that you can look at that aren't really real revealing, but they're just suggestive. There's just something I've heard about that actually isn't in the program that I'll share now that somebody described, and it makes complete sense. And I refer to it with guys that I talk to out later. We've referred to it as a dopamine drip. Because one of the bigger problems, and we'll talk about this in another podcast later, is the dopamine in the brain. This is where we really get into trouble. It's the dopamine that triggers the desire and the memory and the craving for these behaviors. And where you do something small, even just see a woman that's dressed in a certain way that triggers you, and you just look at that for a little bit on some social media site or whatever, or you take a second look at a woman in a retail setting or something like that, and watching her walk away, but it just triggers this little bit of dopamine kind of drips, and then your brain goes, okay, maybe just a little bit more. So you take a second image, and then maybe I'll just go a little further. And a little further. It's the idea of it's what happens when you're checking your email, and then you say, "Oh, I'm going to look at Instagram, or I'm going to look at Facebook, and I'm going to look at my old girlfriend," and you remember, your relationship with her, and you start looking at other women that look like her, or you just go further and further, and pretty soon you're looking at porn, and you just justify, "Oh, well, I might as well go this far since I'm doing it," and I use the sample, the idea of like an alcoholic. What if an alcoholic just took his finger and stuck it in a shot glass and then just licked his finger? So all I want is I just want to lick my finger of the vodka. I just want this little taste, just a hit. And once he's done it, he's going to go, I just do one more. I mean, I'm just licking. I'm not getting drunk. I just want to taste the vodka. Does it 3 or 4 times. Well, I might as well just take this one shot.
Right.
I'm not going to take several, but I'm just going to take this, or even just a sip out of this shot, and then eventually finishes the shot. And pretty soon he progresses to where he's got multiples, and he's got a glass, and so forth. And anybody that logically you can think about this, and anybody that's an alcoholic or has major problems with alcohol, they can look at this example and go, yeah, I could get that. And this is exactly what happens where the secondary boundaries helps keep us from taking that first dip as much as we can, especially when we know that we've done this. If 2 out of 10 times I look at email and I end up looking at porn after everybody's gone to bed, well, that's 2 times I've gone into mortal sin.
Right.
I just don't look at email when everybody's gone to bed.
Right.
Period. You just don't do it.
Now, a question I think a lot of people have, though, is can your secondary boundaries change over time?
Yes.
Okay.
One of the things we teach in the program is that you need to develop them. You need to keep looking for them, and you will eventually find new ones. As ones begin to get, labeled as a boundary and you stop doing them, other ones will show up. And as you heal and as you grow in time, some secondary boundaries may not be a boundary anymore.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
So it's usually good to stay with them, keep, to them. But certain ones, like, for example, guys who say, well, I can watch movies if they've got some R-rated, sexual content in it or whatever. Well, okay. And maybe you can withstand that. But the real question is, why are you consuming something that has sinful content in it to begin with? That's where when we really get into further in recovery, we start realizing that there's a lot of these things that maybe we could withstand, maybe we could, see or engage in and not really take us too far. But why are we engaging in it to begin with?
Yeah. Well, and that's why, I mean, that's a whole other conversation in of itself. That's why I really like things that have been going on with apps like VidAngel, where you can just cut that stuff out.
Oh yeah.
completely.
Yeah.
And some movie, it's funny because as I've started using it more, there are some movies where it's like you cut out all that content and then the movie's kind of worthless, and then you're like, well, why am I watching this movie at all?
Right.
But it is a bummer how many movies there are that are fantastic movies, and they've got one or two scenes in it
Yep.
that provide no value to the
Yep.
movie, and it's like if you can cut those out, but it's enough, especially if it's a
Right.
boundary, that it can be a problem for some people, and it's just
And it's a consideration too, but at the same time, you look at those movies that are good movies, but they have one or two scenes in them that really have no impact on the movie itself if you remove them. Why are they there to begin with?
yeah.
And what's the motivation? And now we get into a whole spiritual level. Is this something to where Satan is just inspiring the movie or Hollywood or people that are creating those to put those in everything to soften us to thinking, oh, it's no big deal.
Yeah.
It's just normal. It's typical. So now we begin to accept it as the norm and not reject it.
Right.
So this whole trend of sexuality and inappropriate sexuality, sinful sexuality, all the other, sexual identity issues, all these things start becoming a whole different, softness to what we accept.
Right.
So, that's a whole other conversation too, but
Yeah. It's interesting though. I was just thinking about, considering all this content, and the boundaries and a lot of other stuff that Road to Purity has, it's making me think. I just recently read the book Atomic Habits, which talks about developing good habits and how to break bad ones and all of that kind of stuff. And it's funny because there's a whole section in the book about triggers and basically your life setup and situations that kind of drive the direction you end up going in terms of your habits, your bad habits that you're doing or your good habits that you're doing, or the good habits that you're not doing. And it's funny because that whole section I was reading, it just kept making me think of everything that you talk about, mostly in relation to boundaries.
Yeah.
And it's very much similar, but the book itself is just for general, I want to build habits, good habits, or stop bad ones. And it makes me think, even like for anybody listening to this who is not at an addictive level per se, but there are a lot of people who have bad habits in this area. Maybe they're at an addictive level and they don't want to believe it. But even so, I think it was just funny the parallels in that book with the triggers and how universal that can be, of understanding yourself and understanding what's going on psychologically throughout the day, the things that you do that you don't realize are triggering other things. And I don't know, I just thought the book itself was super helpful. I thought there was fun parallels in that.
I think what we find really in this, and this we find true in so much of the Restoring God's Foundation program, is that there are key elements here for recovery that we use to change or reorder a person and who they are, both spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally, and everything. But it really applies to life in general, not just this topic. We apply it to this topic, but it works for everything.
Right.
So you could set boundaries for gossip, for that matter.
Well, in the whole book,
eating.
That's the book. That's the point of the book, right? Is it talks about identifying things you don't want to do and identifying the triggers that kind of lead up to them. Like pretty much every time for a long time I watched TV, I would eat, and then now that was kind of an association,
right?
Where you end up being stuck with that. But it's like, I gave up TV for Lent, and it's like suddenly I'm eating less.
Yeah.
It's like that's a trigger,
right?
But
right.
that could be, we're not talking about necessarily full sinfulness, at least not mortal sin for sure.
Yeah.
But that could be an example of a secondary boundary. It's like, well, I'm just not gonna watch TV when I eat,
right?
Or different things like that.
And
I just think it's crazy. I feel like we have so much content like that I encounter it out in the wild, and it's like, oh wait, we've already talked about this, and I keep forgetting that it's a broader concept. Like you said, it works for everything. But these are all just tools. Like they're and a big part of it is understanding yourself better and what's really going on,
right?
And then implementing tools to keep yourself out of danger. so to speak, or keep yourself from falling into
Right.
sin.
We need the tools to kind of, what I say is earlier in the program, it's to kind of help get us stable while we are discovering what the real root of the problem is as we go through the program, start healing the real problem of our addiction or compulsion or wherever you're at with it. But we need to have these boundaries, and we need to have these other tools, exit strategies, and so forth, all these understandings and things in place as we get moving. And we find that it helps guys tremendously reorder how they're behaving and what they're doing, so they can get some sobriety going while they're learning what's really going on.
Right.
Plus, it gives some tools as to how to deal with things that turn up, these feelings and emotions and behaviors that turn up, because in our program, we start getting into some fairly deep issues, and the issues themselves can trigger people as far as dealing with emotions and the real root of things. And if you don't have a plan and have tools and strategies in place and boundaries already in place, sometimes we'll get into things and start digging into some deep emotions or trauma, and it's going to send you right over the edge, and you start acting out because of the memories that you're dealing with.
Right.
Well, you need to have the basis of how to compensate or how to cope and how to have an alternate medication,
Right.
so to speak, for when these things come up that we start
Right.
digging into to do the healing. So,
Yeah. I think having that, well, and accountability too is, community, I think is super helpful for that part too. So if you're going through it alone, there's a lot more danger when you start getting into things like you said,
right.
and
Right.
stuff starts coming up, and if it's not always possible for everybody, but that's why that's so crucial. Partially is having community or accountability, either through being in a program
Right.
with other guys or just a friend
Yeah.
or whoever it may be.
And that's something too that's critically important, as well, is having that community, having somebody to speak to, and which is the sole reason why we created the Simon community, which we'll talk about again later. But it's a community of guys with all this issue that's online. We do lessons online. We have ability to communicate with the guys. A lot of guys will share their contact information and so forth in that community. But that's something that you can access through our website, the Simon community, to look at that as well. And just referring to some of this stuff too, it's not just my opinion, that works in some of these. There's actual scripture that shows this is the way we need to do things. And there's a couple of things that are in the program, in the book. One was Psalm 101:3. Says, "I will set nothing wicked before my eyes. I hate the work of those who fall away. It shall not cling to me." I shall not set anything wicked before my eyes. We talk about the movies with the sexual content. You're setting something wicked before your eyes. That's a boundary. And the scripture that Jesus says, where it says, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say every man who looks at a woman with lust in his heart has committed adultery. The lust in and of itself is adultery. So it's not just, did I act out? Did I think thoughts that were inappropriate? And then step up behind that. Were there other things that were inappropriate that led me to think those thoughts? So it's all these things are not just, ideas that we've had. They're all rooted in Scripture, and God's behind all of these.
Well, we've been using these for a while, and obviously people have had immense success. I mean, this is one of the early things in the program
Yeah.
that you see in the beginning, like you said, to help people become stable. And most people report back that they have
Yeah.
success in the beginning.
I think it's chapter 4.
Yeah, yeah. But I think it's hard today, though, because our culture is so over-sexualized. It's like your primary. I feel like sometimes your secondary boundary. Some people think I might as well wear a paper bag over my head and not.
Almost.
Well, it's like
Yeah.
you step out the door sometimes. But I think this also highlights. You have to be really serious about
Yeah.
wanting to get out, and these are the tools and structure to do that. But obviously, it takes some extra action than I think most people expect.
I mean, there's sacrifice involved in things of which you have to change your life. I've known guys who've just said, I can't go to the beach
Yeah.
in the summer. I cannot watch the scenery. There was a college student who said, I'm trying to do more work from home because of just the way the girls dress on campus.
Yeah.
I can't. I said every time I look, everywhere they're triggering me. You know, and again, that is something that there needs to be some strategies and healing in place to get to the point to where you can be in public and everybody doesn't trigger you.
I think that's a really key thing to point out, though, before people go nuts, is that is still ultimately on the responsibility of the individual, right? We're not sitting here saying that like everybody out in the world is at fault or those women need to, are at fault. No, I mean, there's a whole question of modesty and stuff like that for women in general. It's not necessarily what we're getting into, but I've always been of the mindset that the man himself, regardless of how other people are dressed, needs to take his own responsibility for how he interprets and looks at what he's seeing out in the world. But identifying that that's a trigger for you and staying home is an appropriate step, as opposed to going up to that woman and yelling at her for what she's wearing or something like that. Right. And I know that sometimes it's not even always explicit. I remember guys in college who were struggling, and we were talking about stuff, and it's like there were times where they would see I'm trying to remember the name for it, but they would see women fully dressed. Like it didn't even have to be something provocative or explicit, but it was still just something that was enough to get them triggered in a way. It's just a really beautiful girl or something like that, which obviously there's nothing you can do about. It's not like you can't go out.
Well, there are certain types of clothing that triggers people for various reasons as well, and we go over that later in the program when we talk about subtle triggers. And there are things that like a woman in a ski parka will trigger some people. Some men, and there's certain reasons for that.
But that's not
the fault of the
revealing. That's not, like a ski park is not.
But there's something. It's knowing that and learning that. And there's. I had a client once where a woman has open-toed shoes and painted toenails. That would send him over the edge.
Yeah.
Well, that was a whole thing that we worked through, and we solved that when we talked about it. But there are a lot of these things that that are not things that women or anybody is expected to control. Now, are certain modesty issues that you talked about that are something that should be thought about, and that's different. But it's still understanding these and knowing what to do with them and having the strategies of what to do with them. And there's a whole nother thing on lust, which is another topic that we have on the agenda to come up too. Dealing when you're triggered to lust, what are you looking for? But it just, I think there's an option actually, like in Sports Illustrated, you can opt out of the swimsuit issue.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
I'm pretty sure that's an option, or at least it used to be.
I think the swimsuit issue is dying anyway, from what I've heard. But
I don't know on that for sure, but I mean it's a big trigger issue. I mean it's
wow.
It can be looked at pornography in some issues in the way some of the models are dressing, but so there's certain things in that way, or guys maybe if they haven't opted out, that issue will come in a packaged differently or something like that, and they'll know that issue they just need to throw out, not just say, well, I'm going to look at the rest of the magazine and not go to that part. Well, that's a boundary. You don't test yourself. It's like you don't take your phone in the bathroom. I don't look at the magazine that doesn't have those pictures because it's too tempting to find those pictures. That issue goes right in the trash when I get it. And there are things that are, why should I have to do that? Why do I need to, I have guys say, when will I be normal? When these things aren't going to bother me. And I tell them, okay, define normal. When you're looking at something that is inappropriate, sinful, and is designed to trigger men and designed to be sinful. Is that something that you want to be normal, to be able to look at that? Or is that just something normal means not engaging in that kind of entertainment to begin with?
Well, it seems like these guys think that normal means that they can see it and tolerate it and be fine. It's like I could look at pornography and not have an issue, and not fall into and not enjoy it. Basically, it's like it wouldn't be sinful because I wouldn't care. or that I could, see anything else, however low, that's obviously the top end, but whatever in movies or whatever out and about, and just be totally fine with it. They want to think that that's normal, but the reality is we're talking about the sinful nature of the world and what's going on, and it's like you were saying, it's designed to provoke that response. It makes me think of a song, I don't remember the artist's name, but there's a song that came out not super long ago called Victoria's Secret, I think.
Okay.
And it's this young woman who wrote this song, and it ended up blowing up. It was really cool. But her song talks about what's wrong with Victoria's Secret. And she said, I know that one of the lyrics in the song is, I know Victoria's Secret, it was made up by a dude. And then the rest of the song, like some guy, just basically the song talking about Victoria's Secret just meant to objectify women.
Right.
But it was made up by a guy to make money.
Right.
And all of that kind of stuff. And that is so much of the culture that we live in, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So normal is maybe normal is I'm not acting out anymore. I've had a long-term sobriety. I don't have maybe as intense reaction to some of these boundaries, but that doesn't mean the boundaries go away, because some of them are just things in the world that are not good for you in general. I mean, forget about sexuality. That's just everywhere.
But why should we even consume that type of
that's what I'm saying.
Entertainment, period.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Well, that's why they produce it, is because we find it entertaining and we consume it. And even if you can withstand it, the rest of the culture that isn't, they're being triggered and they're being pulled into sin.
It just slowly gets worse and worse. And it's interesting that, people have gotten to a point where they're, there was a whole thing with Game of Thrones. I want to say that the director or somebody was kind of asked about, there's a lot of nudity in the show. And the director was asked about it, and he was like, oh, well, it's crucial to the story, or it's relevant to, a lot of artists, a lot of movie directors and stuff will say that it's relevant to the story somehow, that the nudity really brings in some reality. But statistically, in Game of Thrones and other places, it's like the nudity is overwhelmingly female. And it's like, if it was really about the reality of the story and some kind of contribution, it would be mixed, and it's not. And not that I'm advocating for mixed nudity, but the evidence suggests that that's really not your reasoning behind why this is in here.
Right.
So
They know what sells.
They know what. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So.
Although I've always found it interesting, just on a completely random side note, that some of the, I think in 9 out of the 10 top grossing movies of all time, there's no sexuality or nudity at all.
Oh, really?
Everybody says sex sells, because you've got Avatar's an iffy one if you count that one, because the blue people are not necessarily clothed, but they're also, I don't know, that's a whole different conversation.
Okay.
But a bunch of them are Marvel movies. It's like Titanic is the only one on there, on that list of the top 10 highest grossing movies of all time that have a ton of sexuality or nudity. If you look up the other ones, I don't know why that is. I've just always thought that was funny.
Right. There's another aspect too of boundaries that doesn't necessarily include sexuality or triggers or temptations and kind of things, but all these are triggers. Most of us that have done any type of recovery have heard the acronym HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. And those aspects are something that make us weak in certain areas. We have something that's in the Restoring God's Foundation program where I take that acronym and I added on bored and stressed, because those are huge. So it's HALT BS. And I get that reaction, that laugh every time I talk about it. But you remember it. Yeah. Everybody remembers it. HALT BS: hungry, angry, lonely, tired, bored, or stressed.
Yeah.
And I see this a ton with college students, seminarians when I work with, whatever. They're stressed. School is stressing them out. So this porn is an escape. That's what they've learned to use as a coping mechanism to stress.
Right.
And a lot of times when you're having bad times in your life, whatever, you have anger going on. It's also with school. You're working late. You're studying late into the hours, so you're tired. And also when people are bored.
Yeah.
Nothing's going on. Well, this is one. I could always go look at this for entertainment. So those are the things that are all something to think about. And what we put in the program is that to be aware of those. And if you say, for example, it's late at night and I'm studying and I'm starving, but I've got work to do and I'm really tired and I'm stressing over this exam coming up or this project for work. So I got hungry, stressed, and tired all at once. And you recognize these, each of these are secondary boundaries. If you recognize any of these and you do nothing about it, you've violated a secondary boundary. So we're asking guys to say, I'm really stressed out. What am I doing about it? Am I taking a moment to pray? Do I go to adoration for 15 minutes? Do I do something else? Do I walk around the building? What am I doing to mitigate my stress at that moment?
Right.
Or do I just, if I'm tired, I just go to bed or I take a nap or something,
Right.
But if you recognize one of those and you do nothing, you violated a secondary boundary. And I've seen so often guys who will be in groups and they'll talk about that they acted out and what was, we discuss what happened, what led up to it. Oh, this was going on, that was going on, whatever. Oh, so you stressed and tired. Well, yeah, what did you do about it? Well, nothing really. Okay, so you violated two secondary boundaries. Then we see you violated a primary.
Right.
See, if something had been done about your stress and tiredness, you may not have gotten to the part to where you needed to act out.
Right.
And to cope and deal with that. Oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah. So they really play into it.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to redirect it somehow and replace these things with healthy responses. So I'm curious, I think kind of the last thing, unless you had more, was just for anybody who's curious, who's finding any of this useful, obviously the concept you can kind of just apply in general if you want. But one of the things I like about our program that if you want to talk about more is how this is actually implemented into the program. If someone was actually going through the program, because there's a lot of help with creating the boundaries, following the boundaries.
Yes.
Because it's not just, okay, understand your boundaries and then go about your day.
Right.
I think one of the key things is having tangible ways to keep track of stuff. So how does that look in the program that we have? Restoring God's Foundation is the program for anybody who doesn't know. I don't know if we mentioned that.
Yeah. We chapter 4 is the one we implement boundaries specifically, but we do a short outline earlier in it. And part of the program, the homework and work that we do is a daily action guide where there are several things that you do each day, certain scriptures and prayers and reflections and stuff that you do. But two of the things is asking yourself, did you violate any secondary boundaries or any primary boundaries? And if you violated any primary boundaries, you're asked to write down what happened or what did you experience in the last 24 hours or 48 hours before that may have led up to it. So every day you're looking at, did I violate any of these boundaries? So in addition to discovering these boundaries, you start looking at and developing them. And we always say, if you violated a primary boundary and you say, well, I didn't violate any secondaries, we suggest that you look a little deeper. Because almost never did you just act out and nothing led up to it. One thing I say in the program is the urge to act out never just happens. There's always something that leads up to it. And what is that thing that led up to it? And is that a boundary that you can set?
Right.
So it's always looking at these boundaries and addressing them. So every single day while you're in the program, you do this with yourself. You look at what did I do today?
But the program walks you through that.
Oh yeah,
it gives you the actual homework. So you can, when you log in online or you have the book, whatever it may be.
Right.
It like you don't. have
you
to
actually
go,
complete it.
Yeah.
And along with the other things, you actually get certain points for certain things that you implement and that you complete and document, and different scores are recorded each day for you, and then there's a weekly score and so forth. So as your scores drop, you see that you're improving. And if your scores don't drop, you look at different areas where they're not dropping, and it points to problem areas. So it's very practical in guiding you through as we're teaching you about yourself and the addiction and digging to find out what is going on and why is this happening.
I think that's, I just wanted to highlight that because that's one of my favorite parts about the program is the hand-holding structural, strategic work that's done for you in the homework and different things like that.
Yeah.
That, you don't have to understand these concepts and then just go do it on your own and just go figure out or keep track or have your own journal. It's like, no, it's laid out for you. Super easy to follow.
Right. Yeah, that's one of my motivations and when I created the program is I wanted it to be from the perspective as if I was counseling somebody, what would I be asking them and what would I be hand-holding them through from their thoughts? Just throwing somebody some instructions and say, here, hope you can figure it out in blind. Well, there's enough stuff out there that already does that.
Yeah.
That doesn't work.
Yeah.
And this is part of the thing that helps is it really digs into specifics and try to keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah.
So
cool. Well, I think that's all the time we have today, but good stuff. If anybody's interested in the program, anybody who's struggling, just has a bad porn habit, all the way to full-blown sex addiction, Restoring God's Foundation, you can find it on roadtopurity.com. This is just one of the many tools that's in there. So otherwise, good conversation for today. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you have any topics you'd like us to discuss in future episodes, shoot us an email at ask@roadtopurity.com. Don't forget to visit our website, roadtopurity.com, for all our free resources and affordable programs to help men and women who are looking to grow in sexual purity. We rely on donations to keep doing what we do, so if you'd like to support Road to Purity, please consider donating at roadtopurity.com/donate. Thanks again for your support. God bless.